Welcome to the Modern Cloister, where we cultivate deeper thinkers and worshipers through conversations about the Christian life, in the same spirit as the conversations that took place during the Reformation at the Black Cloister, the former monastery and home of Martin Luther and his wife, Katharina von Bora. I'm Carissa, and I'm here with Kevin, and we're so glad that you've joined us here at the Modern Cloister. If you like the types of conversations we've been having, we encourage you to rate, review, and subscribe. Connect with us on social media at Carissa Turner and the J. Kevin Turner, and send us your thoughts, questions, experiences, and suggestions for future topics to moderncloister@gmail.com.
All right, today we're doing something a little different. This is going to be our Rise and Fall of Mars Hill reaction pod. So, if you haven't listened to it, I don't know how you haven't listened to it. I think everyone has listened to it who listened to podcasts at this point. This was a massive podcast. I have the listing here. They had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They don't show an 11, but they have 12 twice. So it's 12. They're an hour on average each. The last two were 2.5 hours each, and there were 1, 2, 3 bonus episodes. So a 15-something, 20-hour-long podcast. The first launch was at July, maybe?
Yeah, I think it was over the summer.
Yeah, seven months ago. I don't have the dates on here. And ended 2 months ago. It was unclear when they ended. I thought we were going to get this out earlier, but I thought there was one other thing dropping. But this gives people time to catch up. This had a massive audience. So, as the owners of a Christian podcast, I can tell you, Christian podcasts are wildly unpopular. If you look at the top 100 podcasts that are downloaded average on a month, there's a really cool one that started a couple years ago. It's like a Catholic dude reading through the Bible and like a brief kind of devotional on it. So that's pretty neat. And he like dominates the space for Christian podcasts, and I think he's like number 72. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are no Christian there's 2 Christian podcasts I think in the top 100. So it's no one listens to it, is my point. This made it to the number 4 downloads. So it was the 4th most popular podcast at one point.
Across all podcasts.
Across all podcasts. All
genres, all
which
topics.
Is you're talking millions of downloads. So this was a massive cultural phenomenon. There were articles written about it. It was in popular media, secular, whatever you want to call it. It was all over the place. So I guess we kind of have an unscripted, which if y'all could see Carissa's eye twitching, we have, we're just going to kind of discuss it, and hopefully it's kind of some of our insights, and maybe you'll think of it. I don't know if there's spoiler alerts. All this happened like 10 years ago, but if you haven't listened to it, go listen to it now. Come back in like 3 weeks once you've listened to it all, and you can listen to our reaction here as I'm scrolling through the list to figure out where we want to start. I will get this out of the way. Episode 2, it's called The Boomers, The Big Sort, and Really, and then my phone isn't telling me what the rest of it goes. Really big churches. There we go. And this did the second best job of explaining the changes in our culture and churches from the 50s onward to now. How we went from institutional, denominational, parish-ish churches to our disconnected communities, suburban growth, and kind of the megachurch, non-denominational rise. The best podcast on this is, of course, ours from last year and the decline of community. So if you liked this episode of Christianity Day, this is produced by Christianity Day. Where is it? Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. I forgot the title.
It's a good start to this.
I am crushing the intro. Carissa hates when I start the intro. It's wonderful.
I love it. What do you mean?
Anyway, what was I talking about?
Go listen to the decline of community that we did if you liked this episode in particular.
Or understand how we got here.
Because we think it's the best.
Right. But they did a good job. And I'll say ours came out first, so did they take some of ours and rework it? I can't say.
We'll leave that up to you to decide. You let us know.
All right, where do you want to start? I guess let's start with, so the story, if you don't know, which you should because you've listened to this, because we told you to go listen to it first, is about a church in Seattle called Mars Hill that was planted from another church with a couple of guys. The most famous one, and eventually became the most famous, was Mark Driscoll. This kind of, I guess, blew up late 90s up into... Man, we really should have done some. When did it fall apart? 2014? Does that
14
sound right?
is when it completely disbanded.
Okay, so it
There was some
disbanded
lead
in
up,
14.
yeah.
So there's lead up. Yeah. And there's people, public witness. It says 2006. There's a major issue. Anyway, so kind of a 20-year run. I can say I had really no interaction. I never read his book. I guess his book was pretty popular. I don't know if he wrote multiple books or not. I think he did. I've never read any of his books. I think I first heard about him, I was probably in college. So this would have been maybe 2004, 2005. A buddy of mine sent one of his sermons to me. And I think that was the first time, and they talk about this, and then we'll talk about this later when we kind of get into the technology and things. But he was really one of the first people to post sermons online and kind of reach a massive virtual audience. I kind of looked into it, and honestly, I found him to be kind of like too much of a stick. Like, look at me, I wear a medium black t-shirt, and I cuss sometimes. I'm so edgy, and I don't know, that just didn't really fit with my personality. I wasn't a big fan. But you said even at that 2005, that was probably his peak, you hadn't even heard of him. So what was your first recollection?
I think I knew the name, but I wouldn't have been able to tell you much more about him at all. I wasn't really part of that circle. I think the first real awareness I had of Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll was around 2014, because we ended up, I was on staff at a church at that point, and we ended up going through as a church community something that in the eyes of a lot of people who knew the Mars Hill story seemed similar. And so people started saying, this kind of feels a little bit like what's going on with Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill. And that was my first entry point into that whole arena, which we'll get into a little bit as we share pieces of our story from that perspective as we go along. But that probably was 2014 when it was really reaching its peak and everything actually fell apart and was at like that height of the public discourse around what was happening, for me at least.
Yeah, I don't really know how we missed him, other than maybe just being in the South. We're saturated with plenty of other churches and mega churches and other famous people in the area. Maybe we're too old, too young. I don't know. He's a Gen X kind of guy, but I know he really appealed to young men and really did a lot of good work. And maybe by the time he became popular, I was maybe too old to fit in that category. I'm not sure, but yeah. Anyway, what do you want to talk about first? We're going to keep talking about Driscoll.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good place to start. We have, there's so much to talk about. I mean, as Kevin showed before, there's so many episodes with so many different pieces of the story that it is absolutely impossible to have a reaction episode that's going to cover all of the different reactions that we had as we were listening to it, and that you likely had when you were listening to it. But I do think that there are some key themes that really came to the surface in that, just from conversations we've even had with other friends that have listened to it. And we have a couple of those that we've pulled out to make sure that we do hit along the way. And one of them comes up pretty early, and I think it's actually the same episode you just referenced, the second episode, if not the third, where it talks about the emphasis on gifts versus character in church leadership, and the way in which this particular story elevated the giftings of the person who was leading the church over the character of the person that was behind the church. And when those are out of balance, how damaging that can be. And so I think I had multiple friends and people that I know mention that was really impactful to hear, because it's so easy to see giftings and assume that the character is behind it, because the gifts are visible. You can see them. If someone is a gifted speaker and they are good at what they do and they're a strong, charismatic leader, there are research studies after research studies that show if you have confidence, if you can exist in spaces and speak well, people automatically assume that you're a good leader. They believe you. They have more trust in you. And so if you actually don't have the character growing simultaneously behind the gifts, I mean, it just really emphasized the dramatic disconnect that has when they don't align. And a lot of the people that they interviewed in that episode talked about how time and time again, even the decisions that the church made collectively supported a philosophy of gifts over character. They were more concerned with what the gifts did and the outcomes of what the the gifts did for the church than they were the impact of the character or lack of character, really, which I think stuck out to me because of some of our experience in walking through, similar arenas.
Yeah, well, this wouldn't be the same cases we had, but the idea that, like, well, the church was growing, so obviously character must be, or maybe just ignoring or not asking the question of character. It's just look at their outcome. We're getting tons of people. I mean, I guess they had, the thousands of people on Sunday at their peak, and then opened 15, 12, something like that. Other branches. See, that's the problem, but that's the corporate, what would you call it? Campus churches, whatever it would be. So, I think when you have that sort of growth and you see people's lives change and affected, you got people you got people who were either disaffected from churches, people who weren't a part of churches. Unfortunately, and I don't know if we'll get in this, but just kind of as part of the church growth movement, a lot of it's just stealing people from other churches and how that can sort of be not necessarily good.
I think there's an illustration from the podcast that really sticks out that I know that I don't know if it was in the same episode, because really they start to blur together after you've listened to the whole thing. You're like, which episode was this? But there's such a strong illustration that they talk about, and it comes from, it's not even an illustration, it was like a direct quote from Driscoll at one point where he talks about the bus metaphor. It's like, you're either on the bus or you're basically going to get rolled over and left behind, like in the wake of the bus. Like the bus is coming through, like the outcomes of what we're doing, the growth we're achieving, the ministry, quote unquote, success that we're having is the most important thing. And you're either on board with us or you're going to be rolled over, essentially. Like it's such a graphic visual that hearing it like be yelled by him in the middle of this.
Oh, well, he says the pile of dead bodies behind it, or the pile of bodies.
He does.
Yeah, he talks about being
really
run
graphic.
over. Well, and the worst part is the bus. I mean, he's the driver.
Yeah.
Like, it's not Jesus. It's not your denominational plan of church growth, or it's not any sort of moored confession of faith or anything. It is, you do what I say and agree with me, or get off the bus, or we're going to run you over. I think he says something like, by God's grace, or hopefully, or something, we'll have even more bodies behind us when we're done. So I mean, at that point, what he's really talking about is everyone better do exactly what I'm saying and follow directly with me, or like, I'm going to run you over. And when he says he hopes there's more people run over, he obviously has people in mind. Yeah. And those are some of the elders and some of the pastors that they kind of talk about that are in the midpoint, I guess probably 2006, 7-ish, where they're telling him, maybe we're doing things wrong, are we doing things correctly? And it's at this point, he's kind of become corrupted. I think it's worth saying, if you go back, and I've never really listened to any clips of him before, so this is the most I've ever heard him speak. This dude is super charismatic. It is, I mean, his speaking ability is undeniable, but it is odd at points. You can see it change. There starts with like at least some level of humility where he's talking about, this isn't Mark Driscoll's church, this is we. And he mentions the 2 or 3 other guys and how the other church sent them and how they do want to be different and they're going to be their own. But it's a group and it's elder-led, and what's his line? It's something like, the elders all get a vote, but Jesus is the lead pastor, or something like that. And he talks about how and they do a great job editing this up and cutting it up and then showing later how he even changes his narrative of how it happened. And all of a sudden, he's the one who started it. And then there are those elders that are on there, and they basically get kicked off. They're all fired. Or at first, they start a new elder board of like executive elders or senior elders. And those are his picked specific people. So now essentially he has control of the church. So what it really seems is he started with some great intentions. He started with the goal of reaching people who weren't reached by traditional church model, I think, or at least church styles, because he's very stylistic, right? And then, I mean, the best you can say is he probably just became corrupted by the fame, fortune, power, and it just twisted him. And that goes back to your character. He, they said he kind of outkicked his coverage, where he was so young but so charismatic and grew just too fast, too early on.
It is. Well, I think it really does speak to the depth of that, and also how possible that is for anybody who's in that role to
Yes.
happen to. I think it really, in a sense, like as you listen to it, you were like, wow, this was really crazy what happened. But then there's also pieces of it where you're like, this really was potentially like a truly genuine effort in the beginning, that over time, when those gifts, those natural gifts that were natural and God-given giftings, then had this immediate success after success after success. There is so much that says the more and more you achieve, the more and more you are at risk of believing that it is yourself that did it, and the more susceptible you are to just existing in your own strength and driving forward if you don't have that character development alongside of it. And so I think that really speaks to that. And then when coupled with this whole cult of personality, which is our next topic that's really related to this, and the rise of that overall, it's really, I mean, it's just a really dangerous thing for a lot of our pop culture, Christianity, if you would. This whole, celebrity pastor culture, whether it's, I mean, in this particular instance, it was celebrity pastor, but we've seen it in celebrity pastors, celebrity worship leaders as a whole other offshoot of this. Like you become famous in and of yourself for the giftings you have, and people begin coming to your church because they're loyal to you. They're coming to follow you, really, and which if you really ask them, and it drives this, I don't know, this forward motion that feels almost unstoppable. And you could tell that in the conversations that some of the people that were interviewed were like, it was almost outside of myself what was happening and just driving forward. And it felt like you actually couldn't rein it back in because it was just so central on the character and the person and the brand, really, of Mark Driscoll behind it all as he became more and more the face of it.
Yeah, and then when you invest that much power into one person, if you say, well, it's got to be Mark, if someone else can't replace it, it collapses. And I think this even goes to, one reason, this could be anyone. And there's abuses and problems and control issues at churches across all denominations, all levels, all sizes, every state. And it's just the sad fact that we're fallen and broken people. This is a more famous one because he grew so big because he was so talented. So I think that's worth noting. He also hit at the right time. Like I said, someone had sent me the sermon when I was in college, and I thought it was very odd to listen to a recording of a sermon that didn't, for some reason that didn't seem right. I'm like, why would I listen to this guy in Seattle? I knew that, like my church growing up, they would they would make tapes for people who are in the hospitals or people who can leave their houses, and they would listen to them. At least that's their actual church. I wasn't really sure. And even today, I don't listen to any. I talk to a lot of people who listen to podcasts. I listen to a ton of podcasts. I don't listen to sermons from anyone. And a lot of people I know listen to. It just seems, maybe I haven't picked it up, but it seems oddly disconnected. But so the fact that he happened to hit then, like, added to the cult of personality. The fact that he was like on the forefront of this added to this personality, because he even talks, or they have clips of him in some of the episodes where he talks about, they have 2,000 or whatever it is in person, but they have 30,000 online, and it's like that's not your church. That's fans, right? That's someone saying, "Man, I really like." And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm not saying listen to sermons and getting good teaching and things is wrong. It just, when that is your only connection to it, you're going to end up with the celebrity pastor with the personality. You
do, and it kind of brings us into like right in the heart of one of the other things that really, to me, became one of the more interesting and fascinating aspects of the conversation, which was the impact of media in general. There was a whole episode about media.
Episode 6, the brand.
Episode 6, okay. It was all about the brand. And
so good.
This one was really interesting to me because, professionally speaking, I work in corporate communications and brand communications. I am, if you want to, split hairs, I'm not as much a marketer as I am a communicator, but that's one big field. And so I've been around the whole concept of brand development for quite some time, and I've had my hand in a lot of brand development projects from a communications aspect standpoint. And so this whole arena of brand and media and creating an image is just fascinating when you apply it onto a church, and even past onto a church, onto a person who serves as the figurehead. It very much very much mirrors how companies brand their CEO as a figurehead, as a spokesperson around a brand, that what you think of the person, you think of the brand or company behind it. And I mean, it's a fantastic case study that if you were to look at the success of the brand of Mars Hill and the brand of Mark Driscoll in my field, in my industry, it would be seen as a very, very successful case study in being able to create something out of nothing and have the kind of reach that it had. But one of the pieces I love that they brought up was that the word media actually comes from medium. Like it's a barrier between you and the people you're speaking with. And that's something that we talk about in the industry sometimes, of how do you break that wall if you're, in this day and age, recording a video message to somebody, and there's strategies to come off as authentic and that you're connecting to somebody, but there's a barrier there because you're also speaking to a camera, you're speaking to a piece of metal, a piece of equipment, and trying to connect. And so there's this immediate disconnect. But then there's also this ability to edit and to present only the version of you that you want out there. So there was a crazy part in one of the episodes, again, don't know which one, where it talked about how when some people had left the church and were kicked out, they went back and edited all of the sermons and footage that had ever existed that mentioned their names.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And they went and got
sermon transcripts.
Yes, they got rid of people's existence in the church because they had left the church and they no longer wanted their presence on record. And the fact that you can go erase those things, it speaks to the power of what you can do from an editing perspective. When you're putting together, videos and podcasts. I mean, we do it here to a certain extent. We edit out things that, lots of ums here and there. But when taken to the extreme, you can really craft the kind of image you want in the world, and it can become a really dangerous thing. For all of the benefits of being able to bring sermons and truth and teaching and conversation into the public sphere, it's also a really dangerous thing when not done with the foundation of good intentions, I suppose.
Yeah, right. The technology and media, of course, aren't bad. Those are morally neutral. It's how you use it, what your goal with them is really going to be. And they interviewed a couple guys. I think the first guy who was posting them online, and then it may have been the same guy, or if not, it was someone else who kind of moved up and became their communications guy. And he talks about just their massive budget. And I think he said that they had about 60 people just on the media team. So if that sounds massive, yes.
That is bigger than
enormous.
A lot of companies.
I remember hearing, John Piper, who also has a massive church, talking about why he retired when he did, I guess also around 10 years ago, kind of being old, and the staff was getting so big, and he was managing, and his entire church staff was 60 people, give or take. I don't remember the exact number. So you're talking about a media team the size of another entire church staff, and that's just, and the guy talks about, I don't know what he's talking about because it's kind of technology, I don't know, but something about the camera, something about the cameras, but they had high-end cameras they said like NBC had. So they have we're just talking like 2005, 2006. They're ahead of the curve on all this, and basically, he said it was a great job because whatever they wanted, they got. He said they could take and say, hey, we need this, these people are using this, and they had 3 of those cameras. Go back and list. It's really a fascinating, where he talks about how it's just carte blanche, right? Like, we need to go buy these things, and they say, that's our media department, that's how we're getting the message and our brand out.
Yeah. Well, it makes it, if you were to put in parallel, as the brand grows and grows and grows, and you're saying, okay, is what we're doing on brand? Because that's something that in the field you ask, like, is this on brand? Is this message on brand? Is this photo and video and graphic that we're putting up on brand? For, a high-level executive, is this speech on brand? When you start holding up the brand with the same level of care as you do what you're supposed to be preaching, there's going to be a conflict. If you're like, is this on brand or is this the gospel of Christ? Like, there's going to be a conflict, and it was really clear in that the brand became, just of utmost importance as they were growing, because they were growing it like you would a company, really.
Did they ever say the percentage? I would love to know the percentage.
I'm not sure.
Sorry, that's kind of tangent. I know, well, because I remember a big report probably 10, 15 years ago. It was done internally and then leaked, so you don't even know which denomination it was. It was probably either the Episcopal Church or maybe the Methodist Church. and they were just talking about them having become so institutional, so large, but not really focused on evangelism, to the point that, of course, they had a missions budget, but their lawn maintenance, their grounds for the average church was higher than their evangelism and discipleship budget. And you look at that and you're like, we're doing something wrong here. When we're talking about cutting grass is more important than outreach and evangelism. And I would be sure that maybe specific line items as far as programs, their media budget had to be their largest budget. The way this guy's talking. I mean, it's...
Well, and it's, and one of the byproducts, and this was an entirely different episode, and I can't remember the head coach, was it Indiana?
Bobby Knight.
Bobby Knight, yeah, okay. Showing my lack of sports knowledge. But they compared this situation to what happened with him, and the way that he was able to portray a certain image externally that was extremely different from what he portrayed in his inner circles. And I think that's one of the huge downfalls of being able to craft a brand that is edited and curated externally, because I think that's why some of this was able to go on for so long without outside public scrutiny, because on the outside it seemed, for the most part, to the average partaker and participant in any of the downloads or any of that things were good.
Yeah, you just think it's normal because you don't know. So that's going to be episode 9. It's called the Bobby Knight problem, and they do a lot of the comparisons about if you're a college basketball fan, which is funny actually. While we're doing this, I got a text from someone about watching the kickoff of the tournament in a couple of weeks.
That's funny.
Bobby Knight was kind of famous of like kicking the media out, locking the door. Like he'd lock the doors at practice. He wouldn't let people in. And then, so when someone finally spoke out against him, the guy was completely like shunned, had to transfer out. People didn't believe his family. And so they do a really interesting job, because that's a fairly famous story, I think. At least in the sports world. I think there's a 30 for 30 on it for the ESPN documentaries, and they point out. I mean, this is basically exactly how Driscoll is asking. This is the control freak, bully, whatever else you want to call it, of someone who has made it successful, and then they want to do it their way and only their way, which they must know to some extent is wrong, because they're
because they hide it.
Exactly. They hide it. You're closing the doors and you're not letting people know what really goes on. And if they speak out or challenge your authority, you're done.
Yeah.
It's an incredible
Yeah, it was
episode.
a really, really well done parallel that even if you're newer to the church world and don't understand how it could happen within the church context, it shows you a lot of the parallels because the systems are kind of the same. And so I thought that was a really, really well done thing. So I think there's so much to unpack there. But another thing, and just for the sake of time, we have so much more on here. We have this whole area of his treatment of women.
Before we move on,
okay.
I do think there's a really interesting... I think they do it throughout, but his personal brand, his change. Like I said, it started with him and some other people, and then it became he sat out to plant the church. But also, he's very much like a politician. It's so weird because he tries to do this like kind of fake hard scrabble, and it sounds like he had a rough upbringing. That's not what I'm talking about. But this kind of like, no one would have expected I would be here. No one would do this. I don't know if he ever calls himself an outcast, but he essentially sounds like a politician call himself an outsider, even though they've been in the Senate for 30 years. Because then, the narrator cuts in clips and talks about at his high school, he was like class president, voted most likely to succeed, and like captain the baseball team. So he's obviously charismatic, intelligent, and so all of a sudden he's trying to rebrand of like this upstart when from the very beginning he was obviously, and it's just, I don't know if that's a uniquely American thing, but that seems to be really popular. We don't, he goes on early, some of the clips he talks about, we in this team and we haven't gone to seminary, to basically bragging later about his lack of credentials while also hiding kind of some of his actual credentials. But that was interesting. Yeah. And actually, I'll say this to slide us back into the treatment of women. To his kind of charisma, he also has a style, at least in a lot of the clips they played, where he sounds like almost like a stand-up comedian. Like it sounds like bits. And there's the one clip that they play that, let's see, what episode is this? where he is, I think he's in Scotland and he's talking. Episode 5, The Things We Do to Women. And you hear what he's saying and you're like, all right, that's kind of pushing the line, but that's pretty funny. And then you're like, you shake your head and think for a minute. No, wait, he's behind a pulpit. This is Sunday morning. This isn't like, and it's like, that's, you shouldn't be. Why would you say that like during I guess it was a sermon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think the whole, and this is not the entire reason that the church rose the way it did and then fell apart, but it's definitely a contributor, because the way in which he and then the church, by extension, were taught to treat women is just not in line with biblical principles at all. It set up a very common theme that we see in the church of women being, it's either like we're the seductress that has to be tamed and just like, you are dangerous, or you are completely, in a sense, unimportant and completely need to be ruled over by your husband and any man in the church. And so there are story after story of voices being discounted. There's a heartbreaking story, one that comes to mind of this woman who was young and she was going to college and was being counseled by an elder about what to do. And the elder basically said, your role now that you are married is to stay at home. You need to drop out of school and not have a career. And your main goal is to please your husband. And that's one example of the culture that was created by some of the very brash teaching almost, and it was very like sexually undertoned teaching too, while also having like a very
undertone. It's pretty like, explicit,
very, very much like authoritarian, like the height of like authoritarian patriarchal type of language in the way that the culture was, so much so that women were constantly running up against these barriers of even feeling like they were valued and worthwhile in a lot of different spaces, and feeling like they were constantly, even when there were times of abuse in the church, being told that it was more on their, like on their side of the fence for being not sexually available enough as the reason that they were then abused, or like it was just like all of the terrible things that you see was just part of this teaching. And so when you have a culture like that, that's also grounded in, gifts over character and cult of personality, when you have like this surge of momentum in the media, like it's this unescapable force forward, that there were just so many stories of women who had been just, I don't know, I don't even have the right word, so many words. in that,
run over by the bus.
Run over by the bus in really, really tragic ways. And I think it's really important, especially because of how much conversation there is right now in the past year or two specifically around women in the church. And I think opening up some of those conversations through this podcast was really insightful, because it shows you the really nuanced and subtle ways that it happened too, because not every example that was shared was like this hugely crazy story. It would be like these small things that would happen, and these small things that were preached from the pulpit, and just like the slow drip, in a sense, of like an IV that you have over and over and over that saturated that. And so you were essentially like pushing down half of the voices in the church that could have actually stood up in some of the gap that was being experienced. And in fact, there were some voices, one in particular, and I don't know the situation around it offhand because it was months ago now that we listened to it, but there was a one woman who I think was maybe either his assistant or had worked closely with him, and she confronted him at one point, and then he basically like shut her down, had someone else talk with her and said, you had no right to do this. You were not under the authority of your husband. Therefore, she was like outcasted for months from the church. Like they wouldn't even look at her or talk to her just because she had dared to disagree with something. I'm probably not getting all the details right, but it was that kind of interaction that they were able to show pretty well that it was because specifically her role as a woman, she was out of line. Right. Because of the gender role, that if she had been a man, it would have been okay to disagree. It still would have been outcasted, maybe, because a lot of them were. But it was just this different level of spiritual abuse of like, you are not being biblical and godly right now. Did your husband know that you disagreed with me? And did you go through him to do this? And like all these layers.
Yeah, they play clips of him, or at least, I guess there's not clips of him, but it's the interviews of the women saying, I'm not going to speak to you without your husband here, or I have no need to speak to you at all. Send your husband back if you have questions. And I think that happened to one woman whose husband was on staff. And so he essentially, so then it became like essentially threatening their livelihood, their job as well. So it's, again, it started well enough, and maybe we'll do a digression here in a minute on the purity culture. But I think part of the kind of overemphasis on sex is because purity culture scared people away from sex so much. So then people are like, no, it's cool, y'all are married now, you need to have. And I think that's healthy because he also was encouraging people. So he starts out by really attacking men, which maybe some people found too brash or too harsh. I appreciate it. It's probably too tangential. I know we're going to talk about this in another episode we have coming up in probably a couple months. But it's going to be too tangential. But I'll just briefly say he's challenging men like, don't be lazy, get a job, get married, have kids, buy a house. I mean, he's just telling people to be involved in your family, support your family, keep moving. And so we'll leave that there because we're gonna talk about this in a later one. But then what happens is you swing the complete other way. So you go from, hey man, like, don't be lazy, stop playing video games, get a job, to women, you are essentially a sex object. You are just there to pleasure your husband whenever he wants for whatever reason. And it just, and I think part of it has to do with the purity culture kind of pushing back and saying like, no, it's good. This is where you want, like you're in, a God-ordained marriage and it's safe. And so let's try to cover some of those hurts. It kind of starts from that to being, really graphic. It was interesting to, I don't remember if they talked about in some of this, or I think in some of the articles they would post some of the reviews that were written by other celebrity pastors and other famous people of his book. And they were like, yeah, for kind of a Christian bookstore audience, like, you got kind of graphic here. Like, maybe you shouldn't. And, there's an adult level where it's like, okay, we should be able to talk about some of these things, but is this really like marriage seminar spoken in public kind of? It's one thing to talk about it. So for instance, I guess, our community group just did Meaning of Marriage, and of course there's a sex chapter in that. And we kind of split up, and this is a small, intimate group of, 5 men, 5 women, and we kind of broke up. And so there is a place to talk about some of these things, but he's throwing it all out there. And it's interesting that their criticisms, he's viewing women as sex objects. And it's clear, you read some of these passages and some of these clips that people are pulling out. Of course, they're pulling out the worst ones, but they're still there. This is clearly what he thought. And it's like, your wife is at this point just there for your pleasure and basically nothing else. She doesn't exist to do anything else. It's ridiculous. And then people who wrote kind of criticisms still overall supported the book because they were just like, well, I don't really know if you should have been talking about dildos in a book. But they had no issue with them. I don't know if we're going to edit that out to stay on the Christian podcast. Mark Driscoll didn't have to. And so it's the criticism of him using sexualized language, but no criticism of his treatment of women or his view of women. And so all that does is keep adding legitimacy to it. And it makes it ripe for abuse.
It does. Well, and it speaks to the overall, like, you have to put this, as I said before, it's not necessarily like this was the one and only thing, but I think this is a huge contributing factor when you look at the overall trajectory of the church. Like, the whole growth model of like grow and grow and grow, and like the results we're achieving, like, we can't possibly be doing something wrong if we're growing this much. Like, people, like, we're adding campuses. People want to be part of our church because there was enough externally that people were coming, and there were genuine life transformations of people coming to know the gospel. Like, we don't want to say that the gospel wasn't preached to some degree in different sermons. Like, there was a lot happening, and I think the podcast overall did a really good job showing the way in which God worked and is still redeeming a lot of what happened through it, because as we know, God is sovereign in all things and is working for the good of his people. But there's such a trajectory of growth that, even touching back on some of what we talked about at the beginning, just especially in the later years of the church, the way that they grew and the way that they were focused on more and more and more growth and more campuses and more preachers. And it was just, if you don't agree with us, you're going to be gone. And so, like, it created this heightened sense of, like, people wanted to be associated with the church because it was successful and it was going places, and the name was becoming such that it was present in a lot of the big cultural discussions that were being had. But at the same time, once you were in the fold, if you didn't agree, you were then tossed to the side. So, like, those two sides of it really ended up leading to the downfall.
Yeah, and what's interesting, of course, is, he said they were doing good. They still are, because some of the churches that kind of broke off from the Mars Hill network, whatever, they planted different ones. are still going today and are still gospel focused and still doing the original message. So it's, you know, it worked, but it also did.
Yeah.
It didn't.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I think that's probably, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about the, just the way a church is governed too, to some degree, and the rise of this, especially in the wake of so many non-denominational churches and the mega churches, and the potential for, not that it doesn't happen in denominational churches, because we have a story that we'll share momentarily a little bit more about how it really can happen everywhere, but this is really happening to some degree or another in churches all over the place. I mean, not to the extent of Mars Hill always, but some of the historical church polity and governance and structure has been in place in order to almost have a checks and balances to keep things from getting to this type of level.
Yeah, before we jump into that, I will say we won't go on a tangent here on purity culture. We were slightly involved in that. I don't think our church, based on what some of these things were saying, I think we were kind of on that. We were influenced by, but weren't a big part. It looks like it's a bonus episode called "I Kissed Christianity Goodbye," and it's that "I Kissed Dating Goodbye." Josh Harris, and it's actually an interview with him, and it's pretty fascinating. It's definitely worth checking out. And we've had requests to do a purity culture episode anyway, so maybe we'll do one of those later. But all of that kind of ties into the whole like over-sexualized motif, treatment of women, view of sex. That's all around pretty unhealthy. But to your point, and there's another bonus episode, the Boca Raton Church Planting OG, whatever. It's about, actually it's kind of pointed out that there was a guy who's been doing this since the 70s, planting churches, that kind of Driscoll took and turned that into the Acts 29 network and kind of looks like he took a lot of credit for it based on it. But it takes, so in denomination or not in a denomination, well, I guess we'll get to the kind of polity in a minute, but I think how you keep talking about the gift versus character and the growth at all cost, it takes a certain type of person to go be a church planter. It's grueling. It's like starting a business, but worse, probably, because you kind of have no money, and it's going to take a certain person, and if it's someone who doesn't have a certain maturity or certain character, it's going to attract those harder charging, accomplishment focused people. I think it's just going to lend towards more abuse than other things. I don't think church planting obviously isn't wrong. We support church planting, and every denomination and every group has, they're trying to grow churches, and we're trying to spread out, and of course, bring the gospel. So I'm not saying that's wrong, but I think there is we started going wrong with the church growth movement when it was the seeker sensitive and the kind of whole focus on numbers. Mm-hmm. And now you can get celebrity through it. You're not going to get celebrity through someone who has a much tighter parish model. Like, I guess we should have talked to our friend, Reverend Tyler Strange, who's a Methodist pastor in South Carolina, because they get moved. Their bishop moves them around, and it'd be interesting to know if they have limits on the size of a church in kind of the parish, but like, they're not going to become super famous and make books. In fact, I can't tell you a famous Methodist pastor. Almost all the famous ones I could tell you are, for the most part, going to be non-denominational or kind of Baptist or independent-y. I guess Tim Keller is PCA, and he's pretty famous. But it's hard to kind of do that within some constructs because of just their growth model. And anyway, I think they talk about him needing to be around other people. And so I think if you're part of a church plant or going to be in a network, there really needs to be a lot of other people around you. And they talked about how he just would not take people around him.
That's true. He just rejected a lot of people that even tried to mentor him. He just, there was a certain point, I think he even said, "I'm so big now, why do I need you? You have a smaller church than I do."
He was talking about Piper.
Was it? Okay.
Yeah.
He was I'm more successful. Why would I be mentored
Piper
by you?
Piper couldn't mentor him.
Yeah.
Piper with a PhD in theology, who had been doing it for 20 years at that point, had a couple books maybe, and was out there being very anti-seashell. So, actually, we came to late to a lot of these people as far as our maturity. We talked about our story. So actually, I assumed Piper and Keller had been famous for much longer than they were. They don't talk much about Keller, but they talk about kind of Piper's kind of blow up in the late 90s, early 2000s with him at that whatever conference he was. It looks like it was in Nashville. That was a super 2005 looking with the baggy shirts and spiky hair. It was awesome. y'all, if you could see how much she puts her heads down when I go on these tangents, you would love it. Anyway, what am I supposed to be talking about?
Well, I'm not actually sure at this point.
No, okay. So I do think it takes like I said, it takes a certain person to want to go to the plant, and I think too often that can lead to abuse, and that's kind of. Do we want to get into ours? Or do we want to?
I think it'd probably be a good time to, because one of the things that, and we know this is a longer episode, so for those of you who are still listening, thank you. We hope you are listening because you really care about the church, and because you know what its purpose is, and you know that we are called to love the church and to fight for the church and to protect the church. And our whole hope in even having a reactions episode is both to open up conversation in our circles and also share some of our story, because one of the things that this series of episodes did across the country was allow people to see glimpses of their own story in this big story. Mm-hmm. If you've been around church for any length of time, you've likely walked through something difficult, and there's different degrees of difficulty. There are small, problems that churches will have, sometimes with leadership transition, sometimes with vision direction, sometimes with arguments over a certain philosophy and how to do something. Other times there's actual really large divisive issues that escalate and escalate and escalate. And it's hard to know exactly what you're going to walk into, because the church at the end of the day is full of sinful people. Like this side of eternity, the church is imperfect. And so one of the things that we wanted to do in this is really to end with, as Christians, what do we do with this? What do we do having listened to this entire series? How do we enter into our relationship with the church? And so as a starting point, we thought we'd share a little bit about our experience walking through something, not quite to the level of Mars Hill, but one that has really impacted us, and then how we have walked through that, and hopefully provide some, just solidarity and encouragement forward, because it can leave you feeling really discouraged. I know we've talked to a lot of people who are like, well, if this is what the church is, what's the point? Mm-hmm. What's the point? Should we just not go anymore? If every church and every place is going to have issues, and if some are more prone to issues, and if they can really hurt people this much, what are we all doing? And so without the perseverance and the endurance that is asked of us as Christians, it can definitely seem like that. So without going more into that first, I think we'll just take a second now and we can share a little bit about the story. So several years ago at this point, probably about 10 years ago, we had moved from a Baptist church at the time to a PCA church. It was a young church. It was about 4 years into, planting in a sense, but it was done through the local presbytery. It was
replanted for about a year?
4 or 5 years old, essentially, but I had taken a position on staff.
But it had been replanted with a new pastor that was only a year or so, right?
We should know this. Why are we going to...
Because it started with a different name and a different...
It had a different name, but I think it had the same...
No, it was a different pastor that started.
Well...
We can edit that out if we need
to. We probably won't. We'll leave it. It's just where we are. But we started attending this church, and we're part of it. If you've been part of it, a startup church, in essence. I mean, it was through a denomination. It was planted in kind of a parish model, in a location on purpose, because there was a gap in this denomination being present in the area that we were in. And so we were in full church building mode. I was on staff part-time. I was working in my profession part-time, but we were kind of that on staff with the, bivocational model. There was a lot of people on staff part-time, working their regular jobs, working for the church. We were involved in every facet of the church. I think we had actually just purchased our house when we moved out this direction, and we were barely in our house those couple of years because we were always over by the church. We were planting, we were meeting in homes, we were being part of a church planting environment. And
we were gone almost every night of the week.
We really were.
No kids yet.
And
that's how that was possible.
And we're not going to go into too much detail about all the ins and outs of what happened, because that doesn't really do a service to anybody listening, or even to what we went through and the people that walked through this with us. But what I will say is we don't in any way claim that we had an experience like the Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll thing, but there is enough similarity to some of the pieces, as many of you have maybe found in other experiences you've had, that we really did at one point walk into an issue with the lead pastor of the church, mainly along the lines of, I would say, an abusive relationship with a lot of the staff. It's kind of where I'll leave it. But there was a core small group of people that came forward first to talk about this with the elders. We were part of that small group. And so I share that only because we really were in kind of I've called it for years, the hot, fiery center of some of what happened, and bringing it forward, being some of the first to speak. And the next year and a half, really, just little by little, bringing in the presbytery, having the elders involved, the infighting between elders, the poor management of the whole situation at multiple levels, but walking through it in the hopes of protecting the church and fighting for what the church should be and trying to stand in the gap. But what happened eventually was that it escalated and escalated and escalated because there wasn't any recognition on the part of the pastor that there was an issue along the way, that it eventually rose to the level of having a church trial within the denomination that we testified in, and many others that we served alongside did as well. And the very end result was that the pastor was defrocked, which is the official word for no longer being ordained within the denomination or being allowed to ever preach again or lead a church within the denomination.
Correct.
Didn't know that was a term until this happened. But then along with that, because of the poor leadership shown by many people within the church, including the eldership, the church itself was kicked out of the denomination.
So we had 5 elders, and for those who don't know, I know we got a lot of Baptist friends. Listen, the way it works is there's the ruling elders, and those are the elders in charge of the church, and then the pastor is technically a teaching elder. He doesn't have a ruling. He just preaches. So like there were 5 elders, and one of them, because all this could have been, because they can vote, essentially. They're the representatives of the local congregation. On a 3-2 vote, they could have essentially kicked out this teaching pastor, or made him go on sabbatical, or made him resign. It could have ended right there. So you had 2 very for the pastor, 2 saying, hey, it seems like there's some issues, we really need to look into this. And one guy really failed and said, man, there's a lot of conflict, I'm out. And so he left. So now it's 2-2, which means you can never get a vote. Eventually, during and through the trial, those other 2 who had started the investigating, who had brought charges up, they ended up leaving because they saw it as kind of hopeless. And the church was failing. People left the church. The church, the pastor was clearly going to be defrocked. It was clearly going to have to restart again later. So they kind of stepped out. And then so when the presbytery, the Metro Atlanta Presbytery, looked at it, they said, you know what, you're just kind of a corrupted. So your church, your name, everything, you're gone and you're done. So that's, yeah. And so he's defrocked. He's no longer an ordained PCA pastor. I think he's a chaplain now for a high school football team, and left Metro Atlanta altogether. I don't know if you had more to say about that.
I mean, in general, yes, but specifically right now, you can keep going.
I was just going to say, just for people wondering how it turned out, the church is actually, not the church, because that church is gone, but the PCA actually relaunched a plant there. I don't know if he's acting as one of the elders, do you? But one of the elders who was there
is now,
originally, is he still an elder there? Because when you're PCA, you're ordained an elder for life. I don't know if he's acting as an elder for this new church, but it has been relaunched, and actually, kind of in a weird, kind of cool story, he kind of incubated, the new pastor there, kind of incubated at our church for a couple weeks, and we actually did a joint men's retreat a couple years ago, back when you could do these things before the pandemic. So, I guess that's going to be kind of my point, and then we'll jump back into what you get back on where you were saying. But like, the church will keep moving. If Mark Driscoll doesn't exist, the church will keep moving. If your local pastor, when he dies, they're all going to die. I mean, you got to think along the timeline. The church has been around for 2,000 years. It will continue, and if someone says or acts otherwise, you have a problem. And that's kind of what I was getting at with the entrepreneurial type person. And again, not all, you have to have an entrepreneurial person in a church plant. You just do. I'm just saying it can lead to some issues, because what I've seen it go wrong is those type of people, too often, when it goes wrong, want devotion to them, not the church. They take it personally if you disagree with them, even if you are doing what you think is best for the church. And it causes this, they want that sort of devotion and honor to them. And so my point in this is there is now still a PCA church in that area with a devoted PCA pastor and a devoted community there. It keeps moving. So
yeah. One of the things that in sharing this story, because we haven't shared all the details of it, but it's from a place of wanting to create a sense of community that many of us have walked through different things in the church, and this was honestly one of the hardest things I've walked through in my entire life so far. What were these? I mean, probably the 2 years specifically from the time of coming forward through all of the ins and outs over the next couple months. And if you listen to the Mars Hill podcast, you hear some of what happens behind the scenes throughout this. And in its own way, there was just back and forth, and this meeting and that meeting, and this testifying, and this coming forward, and this writing this statement, and confirming this detail, and having people start fighting in the church, it was one of the hardest things we've walked through. And at the end of it, we lost our entire community. And there were so many points along the way, listening to this podcast series, where I would listen to one, and I would have tears in my eyes afterward, because I would feel remnants of my own pain, even though it's been so many years and we've healed in tremendous ways by God's grace through it. There's still a recognition of what it felt like then, and also the realization of what harm has been caused elsewhere. And it's this sense of you're not alone, and there's echoes of your story that are being shared through this large story that we all have now to reference. And knowing how wide that is and how common it is, and I think that's one of the things that they were even surprised by as they kept recording how many people started coming forward and coming forward and coming forward. And then there was this whole episode at the end talking about the aftermath, like what are people doing now? And there are people who are still hurting too much to go to church, and there are people who are in a new church but still are sensing the huge loss of their community and all the people and all the vision and purpose that they had identified with when they were there. And that episode in particular was really hard to get through. And I share that because I'm thinking that it might be something that many of you have experienced in different arenas of having to come to terms again and again as you hear stories of what it sometimes feels like to be part of a church. And there is such a tendency to disconnect and to disengage. I know we mentioned that before. When this all happened, as I was not ready to go back to church initially at all, and Kevin thankfully had the foresight and the leadership at that point to say, no, we really need to find somewhere. We need to land somewhere. We need to heal around other people and continue going, because again, the church continues. And I think that's at least my hope at the end of this whole episode, sharing our reactions to everything. It allows us to say communally that what happened in that instance wasn't right. And it allows us to say that collectively and to name things what they are, but then also to come together and say, we're all going to be hurt by the church, but as believers, we have to continue to fight for the church and belong to the church because we're called to. And that's like the deepest thing that we have outside of belonging to God, is that we belong to each other in the church, and that our calling is to share the good news, to be heralds and apostles into the world. And we do that together in community through the church. And it's going to be broken, and it's going to come with pain sometimes, and it's going to make you want to give up at times. And it certainly felt like that for us in those moments.
And I feel that sometimes.
And sometimes you still do. Like it comes and goes. And even when you hear of other stories, even if they're not your own, and when you hear of other stories, it can feel like, oh, this happened to this person too, and this person too. And so in sharing that, I mean, one of the greatest things that we have, I think, stumbled upon, at least I have, is that sometimes you have to move forward even when you don't want to, and continuing to belong and to fight for the church. So
no rest for the wicked.
You always say that.
You gotta keep,
it's true.
You got to keep moving. No, I did push. I pushed hard, maybe a little too hard for our family to jump straight back into church, because I just felt if I gave up that rhythm and habit, I didn't know if I'd go back.
Yeah.
And that's where we were at that point. And yeah, in some way, that impact will impact the way probably we view pastors to some extent for the rest of our lives, the way we look at community. kind of longing for what we lost. I mean, it's been 8 years now. We've not restored our community the sense that we had then. Of course, it was also a different time in our life, and so there's different reasons
Pre-kids.
for that. Exactly.
We had a lot more flexibility to do stuff.
And so there's a lot there, but we're committed to the body of Christ and the church universal, and I think that's the takeaway. If you've been involved heavily in your church, whether volunteering or being, you will have heard of conflicts or issues or fights, and if your church is big enough, then you can maybe stay out of them while still keep going on and say, well, that's between those two pastors or whatever it is, and and if you haven't yet, you're going to. In fact, the church we ended up, I guess maybe a few months later, had their own issue where a pastor ended up resigning. That was on staff, and so conflict is just going to happen. You should not expect the church to be perfect, because conflict is going to happen. I mean, any of y'all have like jobs or ever been involved with a group of people? You're going to have, you're just going to have conflict, and you're going to have issues. I think it hurts more. It shouldn't really be unexpected. You hope for it to not happen, but on a long enough timelines, it's just going to.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that sharing the story from Mars Hill shows all of us is that we have to be aware enough and diligent enough to see what's happening around us while also fighting for the church and being involved. Like, we can't close our eyes to what's happening. We need to be able to call things out, but then also continue to build and to share, the gospel of Christ and be committed to churches. So it's this weird tension. It's like a both and. And I think that's what at times becomes uncomfortable. And to Kevin's point of, I think it's really easy to become cynical. And I think one of the things that needs to press up against our tendency to become cynical when we walk through those types of things is the hope that we have in Christ. That's literally the reason we should, as Christians, have an optimistic outlook, because one, we know it all ends well and that one day all things will be made new, and there's such hope in Christ, like real, tangible hope in Christ. And so that has to be forefront, and even when there is that tendency toward the cynicism of why does it matter, that has to ground us. And it's one of those times, if you've walked through this, where you've likely experienced the need to remind yourself of that and to go through the rhythms of reminding yourself of that and walking through obediently and allowing almost your emotions to catch up to your actions then, and continuing to be part of the church in whatever form or fashion. And it's not to say you wouldn't need time to regroup and decompress, because we don't want to minimize our emotions. In fact, we need to feel them fully and acknowledge them and walk through them with the full hope that the church is the bride of Christ, and will be made perfect in its time.
Yeah, someone told me, when we were watching Georgia win the national title, someone told me he and a few other guys who had been part of the church that we were part of, he had started listening to Mars Hill, and he called up the other guys and were like, we need to grab a beer and talk about this podcast, because it was bringing up things to him. And I assume they actually met up and talked about it. I don't know if he didn't finish the story, but it brought up things for him. And one of the other guys he called, was on staff there, with you. And so I think there was some debate when this podcast was coming out, this series. People were kind of writing articles saying, this is disaster porn or revenge, or this is a hit piece. Like, why would we do this? And I think at the very end, where the aftermath episode you talked about, I think that's why. This brought people, because a lot of people have been through hurt. But a lot of people may feel isolated and be like, well, maybe it's in my head. Maybe it wasn't that wrong. And you see some of these same things in this story or things like it, and you're like, you know what, that was wrong. And by the way, I should say all these guys, they're all still part of churches, and they're involved. And actually, one of them's back on staff at a church. So, it's good. And but they still needed the healing. They still needed to discuss it. So I would say this is a good thing, because we need to talk about our flaws. I think that was kind of one of the things people saying, let's protect the image of the church, to the culture as a whole. And that's where we kind of went wrong, is when you start trying to cover up everything and hide things, because they're facts. I mean, everything that they listed, as far as we can tell, most have been corroborated, were facts. And So I think it's valuable, if somehow you made it this long, which, man, I don't even know how long this has gone so far. But if you made it this long and you still haven't listened to the podcast, you need to go back and listen to it. And if you haven't, if it's brought up something, listening to it and like you could talk to someone about it. And I think it's a good discussion point that can help bring some healing. And hopefully it will renew your hope, your faith in the church. And if you've dipped away because of some abuse, that felt like, what's the point? Like, know that the point is to make disciples for Christ and be part of the body. There's Paul telling people, like, you can't turn to other parts of the body and say, I have no need for you. We need to be part of a body. And I'll circle back to your, if you have nothing else, our hope in Christ and our hope for the future restoration of all things is a great place to end if you have nothing else. So, because it's gone super long, and I think we could keep going for hours.
Probably so it's a good point to cut it. So
if you made it, thank you. I hope some of this helped you. We'd love to hear any feedback. You can email us at moderncloister@gmail.com. Or, if you made it this far, it's probably because you know us. So just call Carissa, talk to her, and we'll set something up.
It's true, you could. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We hope you left feeling like you were part of a conversation that opened up more conversations that you may want to have about the church and all of our participation in continuing to fight for what the church is supposed to be. So with that, we'll see you next time.